This is the Protestant Libertarian Podcast, a project of the Libertarian Christian Institute and part of the Christians for Liberty Network. I really hope that you guys enjoy today's show. All right, guys, welcome to another episode of the Protestant Libertarian Podcast. My guest today is Dr. Holly Carey. Dr. Carey is professor of biblical studies and chair of the Biblical Studies Department at Point University in Georgia. She is the author of the brand new book, Women Who Do, Female Disciples in the Gospels, which was published by Eerdmans Press. We are going to be discussing her new book on the show today. Dr. Carey, welcome to the Protestant Libertarian Podcast.
Thank you. I'm excited to be here.
Well, this is going to be a great conversation, but before we get into the book, tell us a little bit about yourself, your background, and what you do.
Yeah, so I attended a small Christian liberal arts college back in the day in Atlanta. It was there in Atlanta at the time, and when I went, I had no intentions of studying biblical studies beyond the the minor that we had to take. And I was a sophomore in a Life of Jesus class, and short of an audible calling, it just became very clear that this is what I wanted to do and had the ability to do. I just loved that class. It just really connected with me. And I, kind of learned that I had a knack for thinking biblically and loved the material, and I just couldn't get enough. And so for me, given my background, the question was, can I do this? And it wasn't about ability. It was about, am I allowed to? Because I had grown up in a complementarian sort of environment. And I just had, although it was in my case, it was very implicitly complementarian. I just had no examples of female pastors or teachers beyond, children's ministry or that sort of thing. And so I went to my mentor at the time. He had actually been teaching that class, Dr. Barry Blackburn, and said, I think I should be doing this. What do I do? And he, to his credit, was just super supportive and just really helped kind of guide and encourage me along the way. And so then, it was just a question of doing the things I needed to do, equipping and learning and growing and joining other communities that were reading text differently than I was. And, all those things you do when you want to learn and you have a curiosity in your course of study. And, for me personally, I had to come to terms with the whole, what is the role of a woman who wants to follow Jesus? What does that look like? Because that's the path that I was on. And it was a process of several years, and had, the mentorship of male and female scholars guiding me along the way. And a couple degrees later, I ended up back at that same institution. It's now Point University, as the first full-time female biblical studies faculty in the tradition. So it was a pretty big step for the tradition. And it was, of course, a big step for me, and just kind of all the things kind of fell into place. And so here I am.
Yeah. Well, I didn't realize that the women in ministry thing was an issue until I went to Bible college myself, because I grew up in an Evangelical Lutheran Church of America church. And so we always affirmed, female leadership positions in our church. And I never thought anything of it until I went to a Restoration Movement college. And there were people there that were really against it. And I had no idea how controversial that it was. So in a lot of ways, your book does kind of touch up on some issues that are, at least in some quarters of Protestant Christianity, very controversial today. What motivated you to write Women Who Do?
So my work has mostly focused on the Gospels, and particularly in Mark. That's sort of where I had done my focus study. And I was very involved in a seminar on Mark's Gospel at SBL, Annual Biblical Studies Conference. And one of those years, the topic was discipleship. And so I wanted to write a paper on discipleship, and I wasn't sure what I wanted to do. And kind of the nature of those things is you submit a proposal like months and months and months and months before you actually get to doing the writing. And so I just kind of thought, I don't know, just in my work in Mark, it just seemed to me that women are doing some extraordinary things. And so the proposal was sort of like, let's just see what the women are doing. And it sort of, as I was working through it, sort of morphed into this, oh my goodness, like women are are being model disciples here in Mark. It's just sort of kind of snuck up on me. And part of that was because, and a lot of people talk about Mark being kind of the action gospel, right? It's the one that he's just constantly on the move. It's really rapidly paced for the most part. And part of what Mark is doing is presenting a Jesus who's constantly on the move and constantly acting in ways that are consistent with what he's teaching. And then, of course, with who he is. And so it makes sense then that discipleship would be about following Jesus. So if Jesus is doing these things, then to be a disciple means you're doing these things too. So out of that paper for a seminar, I ended up writing an article. And then after the article, I was just kind of curious about, okay, I mean, Mark is kind of my area of focus, but what are the other gospel writers doing with this? Is there a through line to see there about how women are following Jesus and what we can say about that? And so that was really it. There are lots of books about women in the New Testament. There are books that tend to focus on, what the letters say about women. There's books about how Jesus treats women. There are books that do like individual studies of certain women, and those are all really great and useful. I couldn't find anybody who was doing kind of a comprehensive treatment of what female discipleship looks like in the Gospels, and taking each gospel writer on their own terms with their own voices and seeing what we could say when we drew that out. And so that's how it kind of came to be, as I wanted to sort of add to these other voices and these other considerations on the topic, not just of women, but of discipleship, and seeing those two things sort of brought together.
Yeah, and one of the problems that you address very early on in your book is the popular conception of a disciple. Like when most people think of a disciple, they think of like Andrew and James and John. You've Peter. You think of those. That's what people think of when they hear the word disciple. But you argue that that's much too narrow. So what do you mean when you use the term disciple as it relates to what we see in the Gospels?
Yeah, so you're right. I mean, same for me, right? When I heard disciples, I'm thinking of the 12 guys that show up in these lists. And part of the fault for that is that even the gospel writers aren't super consistent with their terms. So sometimes they'll use apostles, but a lot of times they'll use disciples, and you have to have context to know who they're talking about. Like Matthew's really sort of notorious for being bad about this, of where he'll say disciples, but he means the 12 specifically. And so, some of that is simply sort of a redefinition of the term, or re-understanding of that, and a reimagining of who's in the room or who's around Jesus. Discipleship means following Jesus. Then our understanding of that term has to be expanded to include the people that were following Jesus. And he had a whole entourage. That's what I tell my students all the time. Like, you're thinking he's got 12 guys with him. He has an entourage of people with him. I mean, sometimes he's so aggravated by all of them, not just the crowds, but the disciples too, that he's like, I need to get away. So I think that we need to include those people who are deliberately by the gospel writers presented as the kinds of people who are demonstrating what it means to be a disciple, right? What the requirements of discipleship, right? So what, like Jesus will say, for instance, hey, woman who's been hemorrhaging for 12 years, your faith is what's made you well, right? He commends her. And then he turns around and he's like, where's your faith? 12, the apostles, like, you're lacking in this. You don't understand. Where's your faith? You're hard-hearted, And so I think the gospel writers are clearly trying to, in that example, he's clearly trying to present her as, this is what it means to be a disciple. And what they're doing is not disciple worthy. It's not that they're not disciples, but they're the what not to do, not the what to do. And so I think that can really be helpful, like reading it in context and sort of, again, trying to reorient our views of what is meant when the word disciple is used.
Yeah. So besides the term disciple itself, the debates around women's roles in the New Testament often center around passages like 1 Timothy 2 and 1 Corinthians 11. And again, my audience knows that I am a proponent of women in ministry, and I know not everyone that listens to this show is. And we had
Right.
the debate episode with, for those of you guys that are listening at home, Econ Bro, great economist and Christian from Nigeria, who actually has to hide his identity online because of his Christian faith over there. Great. And he did a great job of arguing for the traditional view, but we spent the majority of our debate arguing over 1 Timothy 2. Like that was it. But you argue in your book that the Gospels have to be a necessary part of this discussion. So how does that work? Why should the Gospels be just as important as what we see in the epistles when it comes to how we understand the role of women in ministry?
Yeah. So, part of the personal journey that I had to go on was I had to grapple with those capital T texts too, right? Um, the ones in First Timothy, the ones in First Corinthians, perhaps Ephesians, right? Those, what I call in my classes, like difficult or hard passages that deal with women. And of course, those need to be in the conversation. Absolutely, right? Different Christian communities read those in different ways, and come to their own, as you said, kind of different conclusions from that. But what had begun to frustrate me was the kinds of texts that were excluded from the conversation, right? And particularly narrative texts. And I think there's a reason why we do that. As humans, we want to ask a question and we would like an answer. And we'd like an answer in the form of, you should do this, right? A commandment or an instruction. Like that is just what we gravitate toward. It's our desire to see things really in black and white, to be able to point to a command and instruction and say, see, that's how we need to do that, right? But stories don't allow us to do that so easily. They require more nuance and context, and there's just more wiggle room, I guess. And so one of the things that I had started noticing, even in Jesus's own teaching style, is that he avoids that sort of like formulaic, I get a question asked of me and then I tell you what to do. Like he really avoids the to-do list. There may be really only one, and we often try to explain that away with the Beatitudes, right? He most of the time he uses a rhetorical device of some sort to reorient the conversation, right? To demand introspection, to demand a reevaluation of even the premise of the question that's being asked, and to grapple with that. And the way that he often will do that is through story. And I think he's following a pretty established pattern that God has kind of laid out. I talk about in the book that more than 3/5 of the Torah, which means instruction, is story, right? So if the very texts that are given to God's people to help them, guide them into being active participants in his world in the ways that he wants them to are in narrative format, then it's true, it must be true, that God chooses story to teach us as well, and maybe even prefers to use that as a strategy. And so we leave out this whole section of material that could teach us something about what it means to be a follower of Jesus, men and women, if we leave out these stories, and we need to, incorporate them into our discussion. Both, again, what to do as a disciple and also what not to do. And the book, talks about, like, in the process of that, then I think I've come to realize that the best exemplars of discipleship are often women who were with Jesus, whether they followed him like for an extended period from beginning to end, whether they popped in and out of his life in brief moments for certain kinds of purposes, and or whether he uses them as examples of storytelling that allows his followers to learn about what it means to really follow him in the ways that he wants us to. And so, yeah, the book is saying, hey, let's bring those stories alongside these other texts. Let's invite them into the conversation too, and then we'll get sort of our fullest picture of what God has to say about following Jesus.
Yeah. So before we get into the gospel specifically, we have to kind of understand the female experience in antiquity. But you talk in your book, and it's a really great discussion about the problems with our source material for understanding women's roles in antiquity. So before we maybe talk about what women did and how they were perceived in antiquity, what's the challenge that is posed to us historically by our source material?
Yeah, so many challenges actually. um, where do I begin? Yeah, so I kind of worked through this a little bit just because I think this is just information that most people don't realize or know. So it's good to know this information. One is we don't have many. It's just very rare to have a firsthand account of a woman in the ancient world. We just don't have it. The people who are writing, the people who are, maybe they're not all, maybe there are women who are writing, but the people who've survived will say that, are men talking about women. And while that doesn't necessarily mean there's anything nefarious going on or wrong, I mean, the reality is, Alex, you invited me to tell my story of how I got here at the beginning, right? You could have very easily done your research and just told the story for me, right? And while we would have agreed on so many of those things, the reality is it's different. You telling my story is different than me telling my story. So that's one of the complications. No, very few firsthand accounts. Another one is that the men that do write about women or include mentions of women in their writings have their own motivations for doing so. And it's not to say, let me record for history, for posterity, these facts about women, right? That's not what they're doing, right? They have other rhetorical aims, and so we have to filter those texts that are about women in the first century through the lens of the men who are trying to prove often other points or have ulterior goals in mind. Again, not necessarily nefarious, but that's not what they're trying to accomplish, not what their goal is. Women in the first century are as unique as any woman today, right? They're not a monolith, just like men aren't, right? Any category, they all have their unique embodiment in the world. And so sometimes women in ancient writings often are, the presentation is sort of tapping into a trope about women, or they're very like one dimensional. But the reality is that women had all kinds of experiences in the first century. So, there were poor women and there were rich women. Well, to be poor in the first century is a different life than to be rich or wealthy. Some were influential, and some were powerless. Some were uneducated, and occasionally a woman could be educated, if her father let her, or, there were some other extenuating circumstances. So they were women of their time, just like we are today. And so you can't just paint them with a really broad brush, as is often the case in the ancient sources, because again, they're not trying to record truths about women for posterity. They're trying to do other things. And when we talk about women in that time period, and in relation to like the world of Jesus, we're also talking about women who lived under the umbrella of at least three different cultural influences, right? So you've got Greco-Roman often combined together, but that's really the confluence of two cultures. The Romans really admired the Greeks, and so they like brought in a lot of Greek culture. And then you have, Judaism, right? So you also have this confluence of women who are living one foot in each, kind of environment and trying to navigate the world. And that's going to bring up its own complications as well. And then the last thing that I mentioned at the chapter is just that often women are used to present an ideal. This is going back to that kind of trope idea, right? That this is culturally, it's ideal for a woman to be modest, and this is what it looks like, right? And the reality is, you can talk about ideals. This is what should happen, but that doesn't, in fact, rarely reflects reality, right? That's true for us today. So I think often texts that these ancient texts where we encounter women who are being written about by men for other reasons than just to talk about women, they're also presented as women who either are, sort of acting consistently with the cultural ideals of the time, or are, in the case of Juvenal, like bucking the ideal, of the time, and therefore are susceptible to criticism. And that doesn't mean that those things are actually happening. It's hard to determine whether they were or not, whether women were living out these ideals, or whether, the audience would know, oh yeah, well that's, that'd be great if that happened, but we know that it didn't. And so when we read those texts and go, oh, this is what women were doing and this is how they were behaving, well, that's not necessarily an accurate picture of reality.
Yeah. So, what would the more accurate picture of reality be like? So, for the women that came into contact with Jesus, or you dive into the book of Acts, and we're going to look at that a little bit here in a few minutes. What would their experience? And I know we're painting with a very broad brush here, like you said before. It's a lot more complicated than just women did
Right.
these, 1, 2, 3. But what in general would those experiences of those women have been like in that time?
Well, you know, part of the trouble that we have as readers of ancient texts is that we by default read everything through our own cultural lenses and our own ideals, as we had said earlier, right? We bring our own experiences and assumptions to the world with us when we read those texts, and it's very easy and very natural to see or to assume that was the way the world worked, or that's the way that people thought the world should work. So one of the things that I do in my classes is talk about like equality. So our assumptions of equality in our own cultural context, American cultural context, that we can argue all day whether that's actually played out. And I think most of us would admit that it hasn't fully, right? But we have this ideal of equality, which is like non-existent in that time, right? There was no ideal of equality. Nobody was saying this is what we should be, right? And so when we come to a text and we get with that ideal or that assumption about the way the world should work, well, we're not even in agreement on the basic assumptions of how the world should work with the ancient authors. So when you come to like a woman's life in the first century, the part of the reason I wrote that chapter was just to say, let me give you a baseline of like what it would have been like for a woman, right? Because if we're reading these texts in the Gospels about women, but we're reading them through the lens of what we think life is or should be like, then we're missing things like when women are being radical in their actions or not, when they're playing into the ideals and they're doing what would be expected of them, following cultural norms or whatever. So the chapter talks about things like, well, what does it mean to be married? What does marriage look like for a woman at that time? What does it mean to have a family? How does that contribute to an understanding of whether a woman is being a good human in the world in that time? What does it look like to lose your husband and be a widow, and all of those things, the marriage, the family, the widowhood piece is all about in the ancient world, having worth, but having worth only in really your connection to these men in your life. So I talk about that being like worth through proxy or by proxy, right? This idea of like, I don't necessarily have that worth inherently, but if I marry into a good marriage, if I have enough babies, so like, famously Caesar Augustus says, hey, Roman women, if you have 3 kids who survive into adulthood, then you don't have to have someone sign your checks for you. You can do that yourself, and so it's this idea of like, if you can be a good mom, right, and get those kids into society, then you can have some measure of autonomy. For a widow, it was a weird sort of like contradiction in a way. It's like, it's bad to be unmarried, so go ahead and get married quickly. But also, you could opt not to get married again. And then it was sort of this like self-sacrificial, chosen almost martyrdom. I mean, the language isn't martyrdom, but that's kind of the vibe that you get of like, oh man, look at this woman and how loyal she is to her dead husband, that she refuses to marry again, even though all of society is saying to do it, And so it's that tension between reality and ideal. And talk about things like virtues. What kind of virtues should a woman have in that time? What would be expected of her, or expectations of how she should behave? What kind of opportunities would she have? That It depended a lot on your social status as to what kind of opportunities you would have, what kind of habits are you expected to have, and what kind of practices can you engage in. And so just kind of working through and trying to, the intention of that chapter is to build a baseline, but also to have these touch points for the stories that we're later going to look at. So to say, as we're going to get into Anna a little bit, to say, okay, well, this is what it means to be a voluntary widow and live out your days in widowhood. And then we have this example of this woman. So understanding what that meant, from a cultural perspective, helps us to understand how Anna would be viewed in her time and in her context as this really faithful, committed prophetess of God.
Yeah, you give a ton of examples from each gospel in your book about the way that female disciples are portrayed in the gospels. I'm going to try to pick one or two from each of the main gospels here. I want to try to pick some of the big ones. And so we're going to begin with the Gospel of Mark, because that was obviously the first gospel to be written. And your main argument, which is a really, really interesting argument, is that the women in that gospel are constantly contrasted with the men, the 12 disciples that are named disciples by Mark. So walk us through that dynamic. So you have all these female followers of Jesus, and they're constantly within Mark being compared to the 12. How does that dynamic work, and how does that play out within the Gospel of Mark?
Yeah, well, Mark is notoriously the hardest on the 12 by far of all the gospel writers. He's the most, Jesus is the most exasperated with the 12 in Mark. And so they don't by themselves come off looking really good. They have brief moments of greatness, but then they almost immediately unravel that somehow in some sort of idiotic way, honestly. Or sometimes they're even confrontational toward Jesus. So thinking about in chapter 8 with Peter's confession, you're yeah, he's got it. Jesus is the Messiah. And then almost immediately after that, Jesus ends up calling him Satan. Whoa, buddy, you're actually working for the enemy here when you say this sort of thing. And I think that's really a callback to Jesus's temptation narrative. It's so tempting for you to try to talk me out of the suffering that's actually dangerous what you're doing. So he goes from really high to really low. The most common way I think that this plays out in Mark is that a woman demonstrates some sort of characteristic that Jesus has already said is an ideal characteristic of discipleship, is what it means is a feature of what it means to follow him, right? And often that woman will be lauded by Jesus somehow, some way. And then immediately following that, there's a scene, sometimes it's within the same scene, of some sort of failure of the 12. And so the audience who's listening to these stories being read to them is naturally going to compare and contrast the actions of that woman that they just heard did a great job, right? And the actions of the 12, which have failed somehow, some way. And it's not like a pure hero-villain situation here. That's not what's going on here. It's this idea of here's an example of what to do, and here's an example of what not to do. And sometimes women are even underscored as exemplars by Jesus for the 12. He says, hey, you need to watch this woman and what she's doing. So I think in particular, the woman who gives the offering in the temple, he's like, hey guys, did you see that? See what was going on there? This is what you should be doing. So I think it's about placing and about emphasis and that good storytelling where Mark is building that tension, and he's kind of taking the audience on an emotional sort of journey, because anything that Jesus says about discipleship, anything that gospel writers say about discipleship, your audience, who are mostly believers in Jesus, are going to see themselves in that, in the good and the bad. I mean, that's what stories do, right? That's why they're so emotional for us, is because they're inviting us into that and inviting us to relate and connect, and then sometimes to disconnect from the characters we see in the story. And I think Mark does a really good job of that in the way that he presents the 12.
Matthew very famously opens with a genealogy. And the way that I remember learning about Matthew when I was younger is that the really important part of Matthew 1 and 2 is the Christmas story. We all want the birth of Jesus. We want, Jesus in the manger.
Mhm.
That's the stuff that we're really interested in there. And so we have this genealogy that's at the very front. And we're like, okay, so we see David, we see Abraham, all that's great. And there are all these famous people from the Old Testament. Look how cool this is. Now let's get to the real stuff. But as you argue in your book, the genealogy is kind of like a hermeneutical framework for understanding the rest of what's going on in the Gospel of Matthew. And there are women that are placed at several very prominent places within the genealogy. And you kind of argue in your book that this is intentional, that it's by design. So what does the genealogy and the inclusion of certain women in the genealogy tell us about the way that Matthew understands the role of female disciples?
Yeah. So, other than the genealogy being a great text to like call on a student to try to fumble through with all the pronunciation of the names, um, really it's about beginnings, right? Beginnings matter. We know this to be true, not just in story, but in our own lives. We talk about, first impressions, right? How things start shape us and they help us to understand everything that follows. And so one of the things that Matthew does in his genealogy, which you might not find to be an unexpected way to start a story about a guy you want to talk about who's really important, Jesus. But one of the unexpected things he does is he includes several women in that genealogy. And this would be an unusual practice, not completely unheard of, but also not common. Besides being uncommon, it's also like if you think about the flow of it, it breaks up the flow to interrupt with these women because it's this begetting, sort of a structure. And then you have these women that sort of interrupt that structure all along the way. And I think it's important also to recognize that the point of Jesus's genealogy is, as you said, to emphasize that Jesus is God's guy. And not just that he's God's guy, but that he's got the right pedigree, right? That he does come from David. Therefore, he can be the Messiah. He's met that qualification at the very beginning. And so when Matthew includes these women, he's carving out a place for their stories to help shape our understanding of Jesus as a Messiah, right? And all of their stories have these really unexpected elements to them. There's a lot of debate about what the connections are between the women, but I think at the base level, they all have something unexpected that goes on in their story. If you think you've got God figured out, right, go look at these stories, because how God acts, I mean, he just keeps telling us this, right, that how he's going to act is not necessarily the way that we think he would, right? And so the Messiah, by mentioning these women in Matthew's genealogy, what he's telling us is the Messiah is going to come from a rape, from a prostitute that turns into a savior for God's people, from a daughter-in-law who seduces her father-in-law, from a Gentile in a foreign land, and from an unmarried teenager. It's just, there's no predictability here when it comes to these women's stories. And so I think what's really powerful is that every single one of these women act in ways that invite God to work through them. It's still unexpected, but that's part of what they're doing, right? They don't resist him. They often prove to be the most faithful character in their specific story. And none of that would be lost on Matthew's audience because these are notorious stories, right? And notorious women. So they're going to know, they're going to bring, when they hear, Tamar's name being mentioned, they are now sort of downloading all of that story of Tamar into this concept of this is where the Messiah is coming from. It's sort of like the Matthew version of like the Marvel universe, right? Like weaving all these different stories together into this movement that's headed toward a goal.
And what are some examples of the way that works itself out throughout the Gospel of Matthew? So walk us. So he sets this up with all of these very prominent women in the genealogy, and that's kind of like, again, that hangs over the rest of the text. Give us one or two examples of the way that we see women at work within Matthew.
Yeah, so Matthew and Mark often share a lot of the same stories. What's interesting is when Matthew includes a story that's been in Mark's gospel. So for instance, the story of who he calls the Canaanite woman, who's the Syrophoenician woman, in Mark's version of the story. Interestingly, Matthew does some intentional things, like by even calling her a Canaanite, is to bring in this idea of this motif of God's people in the promised land, and who is the other, who is the one who's actively pushing back or trying to thwart what God's doing in the land through his people. And so what Matthew would do then with that story is he's creating that expectation that this woman is going to be opposed to what God's Messiah is going to do, or somehow going to try to undermine it in some way, or is somehow undeserving of what God is going to do. It's bringing all those cultural assumptions and then completely subverting it by having her be the exemplar of faith. And Matthew, I said Mark is the one who's most hard on the 12, but Matthew actually in that story takes it to the next level with his criticism of the 12, because in Mark's version, they're not even mentioned to be there. I mean, they may be, but they're just not. Mark just doesn't mention them, right? They're just a non-character in the story. In Matthew, they're there, and they try to keep her from having access to Jesus, much like they try to keep the children from having access to Jesus, later on. And so they're actually like antagonists toward her. And as someone who is reading those prior Old Testament texts through the lens of us versus them, you might think that this is what God's doing. Like, this is consistent with who he is. And then you realize that actually she's the one who's lauded for her faith. And Matthew even changes the wording in Mark. Mark says words. It's for your words, right? It's for what you said, that I'll heal your daughter. And in this case, it's actually for your faith, that I'll heal your daughter. And so this woman then becomes this example of what it means to have faith in Jesus, and not just faith, but tenacity and perseverance. All those qualities that you need, that Matthew's audience would know you need to be a disciple of Jesus, a committed disciple of Jesus. It's not going to be an easy path to that. So those are some of those, examples of how a gospel writer can take some of those stories and that sort of world and bring that in, and like Jesus in his own teachings, then change the way we think about it, subvert that, or challenge that. And that would all be, as the gospel writers would say, consistent with what God is up to. Like, God's not doing something different in Jesus. He's fulfilling what he's already started in Jesus.
So the next section of your book deals with Luke and Acts, and there are a couple things that we need to, I think, address before we dive into both of those books. The first is that there is a literary relationship between Luke and Acts that a lot of people are not aware of. So maybe you could explain that to my audience. And then I did not know that this was a controversy within New Testament scholarship, but there's actually a kind of a divide between the way that people perceive women to be portrayed in Luke and the way that people perceive women to be portrayed rather in Acts. So walk us through that literary relationship, and then what are the contours of the debate between how women are portrayed in those two books?
Yeah, so I like to think of, and I think a lot of scholars do, the Gospel of Luke and Acts as two volumes of the same work. If you compare the first 4 verses of Luke and the first 2 verses of Acts, you'll see it's the same author. He's writing to the same target audience. And he calls attention to what he's done before. Right. In the prior work, I was describing what Jesus was doing, or began to do and to say. And so the implication is I'm going to continue that story on into this second volume. So that inherent connection is really important. And that forms the basis for a disagreement among scholars about what Luke then is doing, right? Because simply put, what they're saying is they're reading the gospel in order, volume 1 and volume 2, Gospel of Luke, and then Acts. If you read it left to right, and early in volume 1, it's very clear that women are centered, right, in Jesus's ministry. I mean, some of the women are actually funding the whole thing. Of course, we've got the Elizabeth and Mary and Anna at the beginning of the gospel who feature. And then they look at volume 2, Acts, and they go, hold up, like this is mostly about the 12, the 11 surviving disciples and then, or apostles, and then the one that gets voted in. And then we get a little James, and then we get Paul. And it's like, okay, wait a minute. What's going on here? It seems like Luke is spotlighting women in the first volume, but then he's not. He's going with these other guys in the second volume. And some have interpreted that to mean that either Luke has lost interest in women, so it wasn't a super interest anyway, maybe we're reading into that in volume 1, or that he's actually undoing what he did. It's almost like a great setup, right? You think that Luke's pro-woman, and then we get to Acts and he's actually not, like a subversion of it. And so part of what I argue in that chapter is I think there are two things that really push back against it. That argument, right? That Luke is somehow subverting his positive portrayal of women, that we can call into question that he's somehow pro woman, and kind of just an easy way of describing that. First is that women are there in the early church in Acts. So one of the things that I do is try to draw out where they're at. And sometimes we just may never have noticed it before. So, Acts 1's a great example of that. They're the ones, Mary and a group of women are right there with the rest of the disciples, praying and helping to try to figure out and discern what the next steps are and who the next apostle is. Women leading house churches and women teaching and correcting other co-workers in the faith. Women prophesying as a fulfillment of scripture. So they're there, and we just have to notice them, But I think two, and it is related here, two is that I think it is a misreading of Acts to think that it's about the apostles and James a little bit and Paul. Because the focus of Acts is not the leadership of the church. We don't get closure for Peter, James, or Paul. We get no closure in Acts, right? And with Paul, that's particularly egregious because we know he's arrested and he's got to go before the emperor, and this is a life or death situation. And Luke's like, okay, bye, I'm done. And like, what happened to him, right? We don't get anything. And so I think that's why. I think that's a little bit of a clue. That when Luke isn't sort of like rounding out their story in really beautiful ways, and we don't get a lot of stuff about James as the leader of the Jerusalem church, who's really, really important in the early church, what essentially we can gather from that is that this story in volume 2 isn't about them at all, really. It's about the movement of the gospel, right? And we get that. We get that programmatic outline in Acts 1:8. The gospel is going to move from Jerusalem to Judea and Samaria, and then to the ends of the earth, aka Rome. And so when we bring that back into focus, then we can rightly put the leaders where they belong, right? As active disciples who are all contributing to that movement, the spread of the gospel. And for Luke, the main emphasis is, of course, that it doesn't matter what you do to us. It doesn't matter what you try to do. You cannot thwart the gospel. It cannot be stopped. And so for a bit of balance then in the chapter, I'm trying to highlight those women that are there. I don't think that Luke's subverting anything. I just think that he's got this sort of, the first volume is really, of course, Jesus-centric, naturally, right? And so we're going to see the people, all the disciples who are sort of like following him and contributing to that in imperfect ways. And then the second volume is this really focused movement to get the gospel out and that it won't be stopped. And so you just have to have eyes to see the women that are there, because they are there and they're important.
Yeah, and it is with Luke and Acts being kind of a 1-2. Like Luke is the first, and Acts is the sequel. A lot of the themes that are in Luke are carried throughout the work of Acts as well. And so, like a really good example of this is from the birth narratives. The parents of Jesus have to go to Bethlehem because Caesar Augustus declares the census, and then at the very end, you have Paul who's openly proclaiming the gospel in Rome. This is a really brilliant way that theme had carried all throughout. And so, in a lot of ways, like what happens in the first couple of chapters of Luke defines explains a lot of the theological insights for what happens within the book of Acts. And again, it's kind of like this Christmas paradox where we're just so used to the month of December in the United States that we cannot get anything out of the first two chapters of Matthew and the first two chapters of Luke that do not correspond to our perception of the Christmas story. And so everyone's like, well, Jesus and John are the main characters, but in reality, in Luke chapter 1 and 2, the main characters are three women. So walk us through those characters and what's significant about their inclusion at the very beginning of this very long sequence of Luke and Acts.
Yeah. Well, if Matthew was subtle in his genealogy about women and how important they were and what God was doing on the story of Jesus, well, Luke is like shouting it from the rooftops, right? I mean, he's not subtle at all. You've got Mary and Elizabeth and Anna, as you said. All of them are prophets in the gospel. All of them are preaching the good news, telling the good news of what's happening, and are being used by God in those roles. So they all receive a word from the Lord, and then they turn around and share it with other people. They're committed. They believe the message that they're given. One of the beautiful things that Luke does is to take the story of Abraham and Sarah and attach it to the Elizabeth Zechariah narrative and flip the roles. And so it's Zechariah, who should know better because he's a professional, who doesn't believe, who kind of laughs in the face of this information that he's going to have a kid. And it's Elizabeth who takes the role of Abraham in faith and trust and belief. And so there's this sort of beautiful reversal. And of course, compared to Matthew, who is more Joseph focused, Joseph's he's really just a non-character in Luke for all intents and purposes. It's Mary. Mary's the one who gets the announcement from the angel and is the one who sort of is invited to in many ways embody, the gospel in her response. And so you got these women who are so committed, who believe the message that they're given. Anna has waited a lifetime for this, right? And still her expectation that God's going to do this has not waned, has not been daunted because of circumstances of life. And so they become really central in Luke's gospel to the reception that Jesus gets in the gospel for the people who are welcoming him, the people who are welcoming what God is doing. And again, this is in concert with the idea that all of these women culturally have pretty much everything against them, right? Not just by virtue of being women, but in their particular circumstances. So is Elizabeth a real person? Is she a real woman because she hasn't ever been able to have a child? Mary is unmarried. Anna hasn't ever remarried after a really brief marriage. And is she someone to be lauded, or is she someone to be pitied? That's culturally the dynamic at play. And so to see God use those people, those are the ones who welcome what he's doing and provide a model then, right? Because obviously, in Luke's gospel, before Jesus is born, you can't technically say they're disciples because they're not able to follow Jesus, but they are displaying the types of behaviors and attitudes and reception of Jesus that is going to be expected of good disciples. So they are, in that sense.
Well, we get to the final gospel, John, and like with everything, John can't be just normal like the synoptics. It has to do its own thing. And one of the points that you make is that discipleship isn't really a major theme in the Gospel of John, that the John is just interested in other things. But there are a lot of really great stories of women who are functioning kind of in that role of disciples throughout the Gospel of John. I would love for you to give us a couple of highlights of that. And in particular, I think John 4 is such an important chapter for a number of, there are so many things going on in that chapter. And kind of like the Christmas stories, we flattened out a lot of the nuances because we only tend to focus on one or two aspects of that story. We miss all of the pretty deep subtleties that are there. So I would love for you to focus on chapter 4 because you have a great analysis of it in your book. And then any other events from the Gospel of John that might highlight your overall thesis.
I think John contains my favorite stories of women's encounters with Jesus. And part of that is just because of the way that he's chosen to approach this theme of discipleship or female discipleship, is that he really likes to have these like deep dive moments of like conversation and extended dialogue with his characters, with Jesus and a character. And so we see that really play out in meaningful ways with some of the women that Jesus encounters. One of the through lines of Jesus's encounters with women is how they are willing to have difficult conversations. And they will often, even when it's difficult and even when they're put in an awkward position, continue to push to continue that conversation. In other words, Jesus isn't like, whoa, wait, stay with me. Let's work this out. Like they are willing, they want to know. They have a deep desire to understand and know. And so, when that happens, like in the case of like Mary, Jesus's mother, at the wedding at Cana, she ends up kind of getting what she wants because she's not daunted by, his initial sort of response. Or, and I think this is really the biggest through line in these encounters, is the end result, which is they go from maybe misunderstanding or not quite understanding fully. So it may not be a complete misunderstanding, but they don't have full understanding. But they move from that to illumination of who Jesus is, right? So in some ways, those encounters with Jesus, particularly with these women, function like the signs that Jesus performs in the outcome, right? Because a sign, the reason John calls it a sign is because it's not important in and of itself, this miraculous thing that Jesus does. It's who it points to, right? It points to Jesus. And so to have these women have these encounters with Jesus and get from this misunderstanding or lack of understanding to, okay, I know who you are now on some level, and it may not even be completely perfect yet, right? It's not post-resurrection, right? Insight. But, Martha has the best confession of anyone in any of the Gospels. She has the fullest expression of who Jesus is, of anybody. So we always think of Peter, right? He's got the big confession. Well, she actually says of Jesus what the writer of John says at the end is his whole intention for writing the thing, right? That you believe, right? That this is who Jesus is. She's already expressed that in her confession, right? So really beautiful moments. I agree with you. I think the Samaritan woman at the well in John 4 is one of the most beautiful of those encounters. In the course of her encounter with Jesus, she goes from, why are you talking to me? What's going on here? To running and telling her community about Jesus. Like she can't be stopped, this Messiah she's just met, that's her response, is to go and tell. And the way that she gets to that end result is by continuing to engage with Jesus, even when he's poking the bear a little bit, right? Even when he is saying things to her that are uncomfortable, that are calling, to some of those uncomfortable moments in her past and in her present, and yet, or disagreements that they would fundamentally have as a Samaritan and a Jew in conversation about God. And yet she stays, right? She keeps asking questions. She keeps answering his own questions. And she doesn't just talk, good model for us. She listens, and she's changed, right? And that's a very different picture than we get of Nicodemus, who was the encounter that Jesus had prior to her in John 3, who comes, as many, many people have recognized, who comes in the dark, right? In the darkness, under cover of night, while she's meeting Jesus at noon, at the height of the day. She can't hide from that. Nicodemus in John 3 kind of disappears from the narrative after that, and we don't get like a resolution or like, he's getting it, he's on his way. Now at the end of John, it's clear that he's been changed because he goes and helps to bury Jesus. But like, we don't get any like follow up, and there's no indication in John 3. Like if he were never spoken about again, we just wouldn't know what happened to him. Whereas we get to trace her movement from misunderstanding to understanding. And again, going and telling. Nicodemus has all the status and power that a male religious leader in Judaism would have, prestige, He's more powerful culturally than Jesus would be at this time. And she has none of those things. In fact, quite the opposite. A lot of stigma would have been attached to her in those environments. And so what you see is this contrast between her and Nicodemus. And then, this is what's beautiful about John, you also see a contrast between her and the 12, right? When Jesus has his conversation with her, they've already left. They've gone to get food for Jesus and for themselves. So they're not even around for that whole conversation. And then when they do get back, Jesus has been accustomed in the conversation to talking on this spiritual level, which John really loves. John is, at once, really simple in his truths about Jesus. And then also you can drown in them, right? It's so deep. And so Jesus has been talking on that spiritual level and engage and been used to engaging with her. Like it's with her that he's gotten there, right? Starts out about water and ends up with these deep theological truths. And so that's where he's at. And so he's trying to talk to them on that level, and they have no idea what he's talking about. And instead they're worried that his blood sugar's too low, right? That's what they're really worried about, right? Oh, Jesus, you need to eat something. You're talking kind of crazy here. And so you see this contrast between they're just not even there. They're not even engaged. And then when they come back and try to join, it's like coming into the middle of a conversation that's been going on too long. And you just have no way of tracking with where that person has been. And so there's this complete disconnect there. And then that's immediately followed by this fruit of the community coming in to encounter Jesus, all because of her.
Well, I think that's been a great overview of the way that women have been portrayed through all of the Gospels. And as you say at the very end of your book, you're a lecturer as well. And so you often end your classes with the question, so what? So I want to ask you that on the show today. So as modern Christians, what should we draw from your study, and what kind of applications can we make, and how should this change our perspective on Christian living in the 21st century?
Yeah. Well, I think the answer to that really does depend on your community. Because, if you come from a community that is, what we might call egalitarian, right? Like that there aren't restrictions to women leading in the church and the home and those sorts of things, then this is just adding to your repertoire of stories that are just filling out a more complete perspective of discipleship. So it's not arrows to shoot at people. It's not that kind of thing. It's a enhancing of what discipleship is, right? Because we've invited these stories to come in and shape us and our understanding of what it means to follow Jesus. If you come from a community that is more complementarian, right? So that there are certain restrictions, whatever they are, at the very least, it's bringing to the table more evidence to consider and more things to talk about. And those communities, I think, really are going to have to grapple with the ways in which Jesus elevates these women as exemplars, because it's really hard to be an example for someone to follow if you're restricted to areas where you are not visible. And so if you don't have an opportunity to be a model, then it doesn't matter what you do, right? So I also think, and I've been thinking recently, I don't even think I put this in the book. This is just kind of a recent thing I've been thinking of. So, because, hopefully we're all continuing to think and grow. I think it brings some balance to a pretty negative image of women that I don't think we often realize is negative. Okay. If we're only talking about a few instructional passages, by its nature, instruction happens when behavior needs correcting, right? When things are going wrong, or there's an anticipation that things will go wrong, right? So if you are only considering in this conversation texts that are dealing with churches or scenarios in which there's destructive behavior going on, then it's already skewed negative in a way that I don't think people are intending or even realizing, right? If we're reading those instructions, and it's even more damaging if you're reading them outside of the cultural context of the letters themselves, right? If you're not recognizing that those are often used as, and I think in all those cases, used as some sort of corrective to what's going on. Because I'm not going to tell you, I'm not going to tell my kid, hey, don't murder someone if I'm not concerned that they're going to do that, right? I mean, I don't need to spend some time instructing them on the cons of murder if I'm not concerned that they are going to do that or that they have done that in the past. So ultimately, I think the church is more God honoring when we read all of the things, all of the scripture, and let all of that inform us on how to be humans living in the world, and to exclude some texts. And I think a lot of that is truly unintentional. I just think we've just gotten kind of like tunnel visioned with some of these texts, right? Because again, we go back to, by default, reading texts that are instructive in nature to try to inform our behaviors. Then what we're doing, though, really is warping and twisting things, right? That we're limiting the way that God's living word can impact us and transform us into faithful images of him. So local practices of expanding our discussion, in this case to include female disciples in the Gospels, I think will help move the church in a fruitful direction. And it might be gradual, but I'm okay with that. I mean, Rome wasn't built in a day, so that's okay.
That was a great explanation. Before I let you go ahead and give us your final sales pitch. Obviously, it's great to make money because you spend a lot of time writing these books and you want to see your return on investment for that. But other than that, why should people buy your book?
A consistent refrain that I've heard just in the last few weeks since the book's been out, and this has been from all kinds of people, right? From scholars who've been in the guild for a long time to, the elder women in my church, running the gamut, right? Is I've never noticed her before. I've never noticed the story before. One sweet person in my congregation said, I've been a Christian my whole life and I don't remember ever talking about Tabitha, And so I think that that's part of it, right? Is this idea that people who are pastoring, studying scripture for years and reading these things and reading these texts just often have this whole sort of like area that's kind of been overlooked. And so, because it's a part of the story of scripture, and I would say an integral part of that, right? Shouldn't we want to see it and learn from it? Shouldn't we want to see and learn from these women? I think our faith will be all the richer for it. And I'm really, really glad and proud to have it out in the world so that it can begin those sorts of conversations and the so what conversations that follow.
Yeah, well, Dr. Holly Carey, this has been an incredible conversation. Before I let you go today, where can people find your work and follow you?
You can get the book Women Who Do on anywhere you buy books. And you can follow me on Instagram at hjcarey33 is my handle, or I'm on Facebook, Holly Ritchie Carey. There's a faculty page for me to contact me through email at Point University, so point.edu.
All right, perfect. Hey, thank you so much for coming on the show today. I really appreciate it.
Thanks, Alex. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you for listening to another episode of the Protestant Libertarian Podcast. If you have any questions or comments, please reach out to me at theprotestantlibertarian@gmail.com. You can also find me on Twitter. You can follow me at the handle @ProLibertyPod. Again, that is @ProLibertyPod. And you can also visit me at theprotestantlibertarianpodcast.com. At theprotestantlibertarianpodcast.com, you can also support the Christians for Liberty Network and the Libertarian Christian Institute. Thank you guys so much for listening to this episode, and we will see you next Tuesday.